Good evening. This is Victoria of Women's Issues, Women's Voices. And I am just so excited this evening to have in my Zoom studio with me two women who inspire me and who have been part of my process, my growth process as a somatic movement therapist and as an activist. So we have Cheryl Clark and Martha Eddy. And tonight we're going to be talking about how we develop body-mind empathy, how we bring the body into our work as human beings and as activists, as social justice, people passionate about social justice. So Cheryl and I first met when I was a student at the Laban Institute in New York City. And then recently we've reconnected through a lot of anti-racism work, somatic anti-racism. Cheryl, can you tell folks a little bit more about yourself?
Good evening, Victoria, and thank you for welcoming me. And it's lovely reconnecting with you. It has been quite a journey in the 5 years since you and I were together as teacher and student, and now as colleagues. A little bit about myself. I am a dancer and educator with an over 30-year background in performance and education. I am also a dance movement therapist. My primary focus over these last 30 years has been as a somatic educator in the fields of dance, singing, acting, and nonverbal communication. I have been teaching at multiple universities and colleges in the New York area and do teach the somatic work of Rudolf Laban, Irmgard Bartenieff, and Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen worldwide. So I want to give a shout out to my history and my lineage as well. And my colleague Martha Eddy, who was one of my early teachers in body-mind centering. I have to give a shout out to her.
Well, and that's the other exciting piece about this is that we reconnected because the Laban Institute itself is saying, how do we bring a more aware, inclusive, actively anti-racist presence into the somatic work? I mean, because Laban was a white man from Europe. Right. So that's been another of the places that we've connected. So yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So,
and I'm just going to say one very quick thing. The history of the Laban Bartenieff Institute of Movement Studies, we also have to look at American history. And the Institute is 40 years old. And who were those early founders? We are of that original time. And how do we bring in 40 years ago, it was primarily white voices leading and forming and shaping. And how do we bring more voices in now to lead and form and shape the work of the body when we're looking at so many bodies? Who is included in our work? Who is excluded in our work?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's also a little teaser for listeners who find that interesting, because I will be sometime later in this year interviewing Karen Bradley about the work within the Laban Institute and exactly that topic. So, and Martha Eddy, welcome. So Martha and I are professional peers, but we really, we connected through my grandmother's hands, through ISMETA work. And ISMETA is the International Somatic Movement Organization. And we also, most recently have been doing, I've been involved with something that I call socially conscious meditation. And Martha bringing such power. I've just been so excited to be able to bring my activism into all these different levels of my life, right? To think about meditation as a form of activism, right? So Martha, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. So this is a great pleasure. I have worked with Cheryl in this topic area of the socially conscious body, which is actually a term that Carol Swann, my co-founder and director of Moving On Center, first in Oakland, now in the Bay, still in the Bay Area of San Francisco, developed. And so I really appreciate, Victoria, that you brought in that term. The socially conscious body has then morphed into what I developed as a preparation for the election in 2020, which was envisioning safety and peace in the White House and really looking to see what we need to do to embrace these incredible differences that exist amongst people and find ways for people to have more empathy for people that are being harmed by policies in governance. So it's been a pleasure having you in those Monday night meditations that are now Wednesdays at 5 Eastern time. And I've really also enjoyed that you've been present in the study group that we do with my grandmother's hands, which is so different than a book group. And you've been so articulate about that, that the idea to spend a year really delving into our bodily responses to experiences of racism. And then for us, not only being part of Resmaa Menakem's study groups with the rooted community, but to also be meeting with our professional peers in somatic work. And for those of you that don't know what somatics means, it's the body-mind connection. It's the idea of the living body having knowledge and wisdom. So soma is a Greek word, which means body, and it means the living body that can heal itself, that can self-regulate. So many of us have been doing this kind of embodied work, I myself, for over 45 years. And so it's exciting to see it find its way into social justice work and to have it led by people of color, given what Cheryl just said about so many somatic fields, including the Laban work and the body mind centering work, which I have taught in both of them for many, many years, to have been so white dominant. And one thing, last thing I'll say is that with Moving On Center, we, in 1994, when we established our mission, we said, bridging somatics and social change. So right from the beginning, we always were, we placed ourselves in Oakland for a reason, downtown Oakland, not, not Piedmont, just really bringing the work and being in communities of color in doing the work and allowing ourselves as predominantly white leaders to allow the work to be shaped by the people of Oakland, if you will, and many Asian, as well as African American, as well as African, as well as Latino and other people of color. Yeah, so that's great.
Thank you both so much. And listeners, I'm just going to invite you to just take a moment, because I realize that this is the language and the work that Cheryl, Martha, and I are immersed and embedded in every day, all the time. And we've used a lot of words and concepts and that may be unfamiliar. And I'm just going to invite you, listeners, to let yourself take a moment and just know that some of these concepts we're talking about may be new to you, and yet we're really always bringing it back to the body. So just letting yourself let one or two really salient things from this interview settle in you, and just know if there's any questions you have about what comes up in this interview, you can always reach out to me at WIWV@kopn.org for deeper conversation, to find out more about any of the things that were just brought up or that we bring up in this time. So So we, the three of us connected when you two did a workshop where you were really looking at clinicians, at therapists, and how as a therapist, I could have ways to think about this, to feel about this. But in this interview, we're bringing it out a little broader to make this applicable for anyone who's listening to this, whether they're a therapist, an educator, or someone who simply is interested in this topic in their everyday life. So Cheryl, if you could talk a little bit about the models or the frameworks.
Yes. And part of our workshop, I'll say what the half of the title, recognizing and dismantling oppressive assumptions and actions. You don't need to be a clinician to look at your own assumptions or your own non-actions. So as a teacher, I'll start as a teacher, and maybe as a US citizen. As a US citizen, I am born in the United States. And I have to say something a little bit about my background. I'm also biracial. And I'm biracial at a time when there were very few people who were born of I'm Eastern European, and I'm also the child of slaves. So, but my model as an American citizen is one that is primarily Eurocentric. Those Western values, all of that was the priority in all of my education, whether I was learning history, whether it was literature and English, what were the books given, whether it was my dance training was primarily in the Eurocentric tradition. My somatic training is all Eurocentric. So what does that make me as a teacher? Someone who has learned only from one culture. And then when I am working with cultures, and I have to say, when I'm working with my own, when I'm working with students who are Black, and I'm coming in with my Euro values as a Black woman, that have I been advancing an individual's understanding and autonomy, or have I been superimposing this very white-centric, white-valued model? And the answer, I have to say, is yes, that is what I have done. And I don't say that with any particular happiness. And Martha and I, when Martha wrote a book I believe it was 5 years ago, Martha, and I interviewed her, and there was something about social justice, and this was creeping up for me back then. And I asked her, I said, well, why am I and a few other people like myself involved in these communities? And I started answering that question for myself, is because it's not the assumption, and this is the assumption of safety. Why would you go to those who have historically oppressed you and feel like this is the place where I can find my comfort, where I can find my breath? Now, when I was studying with Martha, I found her work inspiring and breath-giving. And I said that in the interview. I said it was breath-giving. It wasn't breathtaking. But look at where we are, where breath is being taken, where people coming into a classroom do not feel safe enough to let go and breathe. That I have had a model of, I have a schemata that I've been working with that I have to dismantle for myself.
I
myself.
feel myself, there's a quote, and I don't know the exact quote, but it's something like, does a fish know it's swimming in water? Right. And that a fish is just comfortable in the water. But another being, right, like, that comes in, can't breathe in that water, right? We can't breathe, right? And that's what I feel like, that somehow, like noticing the things that I assume because I am comfortable with them in my body, like I feel the comfort, right? And the things that I don't feel comfortable with, because like I notice my breath gets taken away, something gets tightened up, right? And then that assumption that because I'm comfortable, well, you must be comfortable.
Exactly.
Right? Or if I'm uncomfortable, you must be uncomfortable. Right. And stepping away from that and actually giving people permission to say, right, that they don't actually feel comfortable, or that they do feel comfortable, right? That they know it in their body, right? Not because I'm saying this is the right way we do this. Right. So Martha, what do you want to add to that?
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm always just sucked into these conversations for the depth that they bring in. And I do truly believe it is because we are, as somaticists, I will say, as people that believe in this body-mind connection, we are fighting a period in history, the Descartesian period, the Cartesian period, in which the mind and the body were split. And if we go to any indigenous culture, this would not be the conversation, probably, because we would be dancing it and we would be drumming to it and we would be doing oral storytelling instead of reading about it. So that's one of the models I brought to this work, which was, I'm a third culture kid, and that was something one of my students, who was also already a therapist, who is Dr. Talia Shafir, said, I've heard about your life story and you need to know about this book. So check out Third Culture Kid. It's mostly about military brats and corporate kids or embassy kids that live in other cultures, but actually live on a base. And so they've got their cultures within a culture within a culture. And I didn't quite get it, like, why is she giving me this book? But I grew up as a white person in a Black and Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York City. And I found one line in this book that said, you could actually be living in your dominant culture, but in a subculture within that culture. And if you're different from that culture, then you're a third culture kid. Right. And I went, it was the first time. And here's the bodily response. Right. Oh, someone gets me. There are other people in the world that have this experience. And I'd like to meet more of them that have my personal experience. I have not, except I do have a brother and a sister. And we were part of a kind of collective of families that chose to go into poverty-stricken, then called slum, now maybe called ghetto, but mostly called disadvantaged community, in East Harlem. And my parents met each other there, two individuals that chose to do their field work there for seminary. And both really became community activists. So what I want to say is that's, I think many of you know what happens in the household, what happens at the dinner table, if you happen to have that model of sitting at a dinner table together, infuses into your being in a way that becomes models. Like, it's not always what you learn in school, right? And that model of always kind of questioning who was speaking and why sort of came right up. I mean, typical dinner table. Dad's got to go now down to the precinct because Butch just got arrested for no good reason. And, let's see if we can get him out. I'm saying Butch, it could have been Henry, it could have been Rosario. I mean, it just was man after man after man, mostly, who were being brutalized for no good reason. And so I think I took that into my head when I got into the somatic field. And I kept saying, wait a minute, Irmgard studied Qigong. Irmgard Bartenieff is the person who brought the Laban work to the United States. And so that's a model, this Laban work. But I saw it. She studied Qigong. I read it on one little line. And then Bonnie Cohn, she spent years in Japan. And Emily Conrad danced in Haiti under Doc. So it was like I became the person that investigated those roots of our somatic field. And that probably was to help me feel like, yes, we all come from more multiple ancestries and roots than sometimes we're willing to talk about. And that has been a big model for me, along with more recently womanist theology. I'm not a theologian. I'm not even really religious. I'm spiritual, and I do these spiritual meditation groups that are socially conscious. But I really am finding so much strength from the African-American women that speak to womanist theology.
So I'm gonna bring something in as like the ending of this first section. And folks, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, or even if you're not enjoying it, but you're finding that you're curious, you're interested, maybe a little excited, even if you're uncomfortable with what we're talking about, I really invite you to stay for the second half. We're going to talk about breath as a social justice issue. We're going to talk about exhaustion and how you can be an active, a proactive, an upstander. I love that term, right? Person in your body and in your community, and to be an anti-racist. Right? But the imagery that came up for me when you were talking, Martha, is this research I heard years ago that they said that people who sat at the same seat in their dining room table, dad always sat in this chair, mom always sat in this chair, you always sat in this chair. Actually, that affects your body. That affects how your brain developed, because the relationship you had with the person to your right is literally different than the relationship you'll have with the person on the left. Even if, the relationship itself is generally the same, your body has responded to it differently. And I think about that, taking that into community, right? Who you are sitting with, who do you include at the table? Who's always at the head of the table? Are you always sitting, right? And are the relationships between you always the same, or are you mixing them up, right? And with that, we're gonna end this first half. See you back at the second half.